Property and Casualty Practice Note 2022 1. Introduction. This practice note is not a promulgation of the Actuarial Standards Board, is not an actuarial standard of practice, is not binding upon any actuary, and is not a definitive statement as to what constitutes generally accepted practice in the area under discussion. Events occurring subsequent to the publication of this practice note may make the practices described in this practice note irrelevant or obsolete. This practice note was prepared by the Committee on Property and Liability Financial Reporting, COPLFR, of the Casualty Practice Council of the American Academy of Actuaries, the Academy. COPLFR is a committee comprised of actuaries from various roles in the property and casualty (P&C) industry that monitors and advises on activities as respects financial reporting related to property and casualty (P&C) risks. COPLFR annually updates and publishes this practice note to include discussion regarding changes in the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, Property Casualty, the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, regarding the actuarial opinion, the actuarial opinion summary, and actuarial report. COPLFR also authors other publications useful for practicing actuaries and provides comment from an independent actuarial viewpoint on financial reporting issues and proposed reporting changes as they develop that may impact the work of practicing actuaries. 1.1. What are practice notes? The Academy's guidelines for developing practice notes states, the purpose of practice notes is to provide information to actuaries on current or emerging practices in which their peers are engaged. They are intended to supplement the available actuarial literature, especially where the practices addressed are subject to evolving technology, recently adopted external requirements, or advances in actuarial science or other applicable disciplines. Practice notes are not interpretations of actuarial standards of practice, nor are they meant to be a codification of generally accepted actuarial practice. Actuaries are not bound in any way to comply with practice notes or to conform their work to the practices described in practice notes. 1.1.1 Discussion. Practice notes provide discussion and illustration on areas of common practice among actuaries. Each practice note focuses on a specific topic or application of practice. As noted in the Academy's guidelines, practice notes are not intended to be an interpretation of the actuarial standards of practice, nor are practice notes meant to be a codification of generally accepted or appropriate actuarial practice. Actuaries are not in any way bound to comply with practice notes or to conform their work to the practices they describe. 1.2. Purpose of this practice note. The purpose of this practice note is to provide information to actuaries on current practices in which their peers are engaged related to signing a P&C Statement of Actuarial Opinion, or SAO, and Actuarial Opinion Summary, AOS, as required by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC. 1.2.1 Discussion. Each year, COPLFR reviews and updates the practice note for SAOs on P&C loss reserves. The updates typically include discussion around changes in the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, Property Casualty, Actuarial Opinion, the NAIC SAO Instructions. Changes to this year's practice note that are a result of new 2022 requirements from the Actuarial Standards Board, ASB, or NAIC, i.e., New or Revised Actuarial Standard of Practice, ASOP, NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, or SSAP, are highlighted in yellow, while additional discussion or clarifying edits are highlighted in gray. Minor edits such as year changes, moving text, correcting typos, and areas with deleted text may not be highlighted. FAQ. Are actuaries required to comply with this practice note or follow these illustrations provided herein? No. The practice note provides information to actuaries on current and emerging practices in which their peers are engaged. Actuaries are not bound in any way to comply with practice notes or to conform their work to the practices described in practice notes. 1.2.2 Terms of Construction. As with the ASOPs promulgated by the ASB, there are certain terms used throughout this practice note that are integral to an informed reading. These include must, should, and may. Rather than paraphrase these definitions, we will quote the definitions as provided in ASOP number 1, Introductory Standard of Practice, Section 2.1. These definitions are equally applicable to this practice note. Must or should. The words must and should are used to provide guidance in the ASOPs. Must, as used in the ASOPs, means that the ASB does not anticipate that the actuary will have any reasonable alternative but to follow a particular course of action. In contrast, the word should indicates what is normally the appropriate practice for an actuary to follow when rendering actuarial services. Situations may arise where the actuary applies professional judgment and concludes that complying with this practice would be inappropriate, given the nature and purpose of the assignment and the principal's needs, or that, under the circumstances, it would not be reasonable or practical to follow the practice. Failure to follow a course of action denoted by either the term must or should constitutes a deviation from the guidance of the ASOP. In either event, the actuary is directed to ASOP number 41, Actuarial Communications. The terms must and should are generally followed by a verb or phrase denoting actions, such as disclose, document, consider, or take into account. For example, the phrase should consider is often used to suggest potential courses of action. If, after consideration, in the actuary's professional judgment an action is not appropriate, the action is not required, and failure to take this action is not a deviation from the guidance in the standard. May. May, as used in the ASOPs, means that the course of action described is one that would be considered reasonable and appropriate in many circumstances. May, in ASOPs, is often used when providing examples. For example, factors the actuary may consider, methods that may be appropriate. It is not intended to indicate that a course of action is reasonable and appropriate in all circumstances, nor to imply that alternative courses of action are impermissible. Additionally, this practice note uses the term required when the course of action is required by a particular body, e.g., the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, as specified. 1.3 Scope of Practice Note. According to the NAIC SAO instructions, there is to be included with or attached to page 1 of the annual statement the statement of the appointed actuary, entitled Statement of Actuarial Opinion, setting forth his or her opinion relating to reserves specified in the scope paragraph. The actuarial opinion, both the narrative and required exhibits, shall be in the format of and contain the information required by this section of the Annual Statement Instructions, Property and Casualty. FAQ. Does the scope of this practice note include title insurance opinions? While the NAIC SAO instructions for title opinions are included in Appendix 1.3, there is no explicit discussion around title opinions. However, actuaries may look to this practice note for discussion around many topics that are similar. This practice note is intended to assist actuaries by describing practices that COPLFR believes are commonly employed in issuing SAOs and AOSs on loss and loss adjustment expense, or LAE, reserves, in compliance with the NAIC SAO instructions for 2022. Actuaries may also find this information useful in preparing statements of actuarial opinion for other audiences or regulators. 1.3.1 Discussion. Approaches other than the ones described within this practice note may also be in common use. The information contained in this practice note is not binding on any actuary and is not a definitive statement of what constitutes generally accepted or appropriate practice in this area. Note: information taken from NAIC materials has been reproduced with the NAIC's permission. Unauthorized replication or distribution of NAIC materials is strictly prohibited. COPLFR appreciates the comments it has received since the issuance of the prior year's practice note and has incorporated a number of suggestions in this update. COPLFR also welcomes suggested improvements for future updates of this practice note. Suggestions may be sent to the current chairperson of COPLFR through the Academy's Casualty Policy Analyst at casualty@actuary.org. Overview of resources. The Code of Professional Conduct, or the Code, requires actuaries to be familiar with and keep current with not only the Code, but also applicable law and rules of professional conduct for the jurisdictions in which the actuary renders actuarial services. Appendix 1 of this practice note provides the NAIC SAO instructions with respect to the P&C SAO and AOS. The NAIC SAO instructions for title insurance SAOs are also included for informational purposes only. No discussion is included. Individual states may have requirements that modify or supplement the NAIC annual statement instructions. The appointed actuary is encouraged to refer to the Academy's 2022 P&C Loss Reserve Law Manual for guidance on these points. The 2022 P&C Loss Reserve Law Manual is available for purchase from the Academy. Additionally, actuaries are encouraged to carefully read and consider regulatory guidance on property and casualty statutory statements of actuarial opinion summaries, and actuarial reports for the year 2022, as prepared by the NAIC's Actuarial Opinion C Working Group, AOWG, of the Casualty Actuarial and Statistical C Task Force, CASTF, herein referred to as AOWG Regulatory Guidance, as included in Appendix 2. The AOWG Regulatory Guidance pertains to the 2022 SAO and the AOS and supplements the NAIC SAO instructions. The purpose is to provide timely regulatory guidance and clarity to companies and appointed actuaries regarding regulatory expectations with respect to the SAO and AOS. Note that, absent a possible reference in state law or regulation, the AOWG regulatory guidance is not binding. References to the AOWG regulatory guidance are included throughout this practice note. Chapter 9 provides a listing of the most relevant actuarial standards of practice, ASOPs, and statements of statutory accounting principles, SSAPs, that apply to the material covered by this practice note. It also provides resources to actuaries providing opinions other than those covered by the scope of this practice note. Definitions 1.4.1 ASB. As explained in ASOP number 1, the Actuarial Standards Board, ASB, promulgates actuarial standards of practice, ASOPs, for use by actuaries when rendering actuarial services in the United States. The ASB is vested by the U.S.-based actuarial organizations with the responsibility for promulgating ASOPs for actuaries rendering actuarial services in the United States. Each of these organizations requires its members, through its Code of Professional Conduct, to satisfy applicable ASOPs when rendering actuarial services in the United States. CASTF. According to the NAIC website, the mission of the NAIC CASTF is to identify, investigate, and develop solutions to actuarial problems and statistical issues in the P&C industry. The task force's goals are to assist state insurance regulators with maintaining the financial health of P&C insurers, ensuring that P&C insurance rates are not excessive, inadequate, or unfairly discriminatory, and ensuring that appropriate data regarding P&C insurance markets are available. FAQ. Are ASOPs binding on members of the U.S.-based actuarial organizations when rendering actuarial services in the U.S.? Yes. According to ASOP number 1, Section 1, ASOPs are binding on members of the U.S.-based actuarial organizations when rendering actuarial services in the U.S. While these ASOPs are binding, they are not the only considerations that affect an actuary's work. Other considerations may include legal and regulatory requirements, professional requirements promulgated by employers or actuarial organizations, evolving actuarial practice, and the actuary's own professional judgment informed by the nature of the engagement. The ASOPs provide a basic framework that is intended to accommodate these additional considerations. AOWG. According to the NAIC website, the 2022 charges of the AOWG were A. Propose revisions to the following as needed, especially to improve actuarial opinion summaries, and actuarial reports, as well as the regulatory analysis of these actuarial documents and loss and premium reserves. 1. Financial Analysis Handbook. 2. Financial Condition Examiner's Handbook. 3. Annual Statement Instructions Property Casualty. 4. Regulatory Guidance to Appointed Actuaries and Companies. 5. Other financial blanks and instructions as needed. ASOPs. According to the ASB website, ASOPs identify what the actuary should consider, document, and disclose when performing an actuarial assignment, and set standards for appropriate practice for the U.S. SSAPs. Statements of Statutory Accounting Principles. SSAPs are published by the NAIC in its Accounting Practices and Procedures Manual. The manual includes more than 100 SSAPs, which serve as the basis for preparing and issuing statutory financial statements for insurance companies in the U.S. in accordance with or in the absence of specific statutes or regulations promulgated by individual states. 1.5. Organization of this practice note. Each chapter in this practice note begins with an opening paragraph describing the contents and includes an excerpt of the actual NAIC SAO instructions pertaining to the chapter. Separate sections within the chapter provide details on the topic, including further quoted instruction, definitions, discussion, and illustrative language. The FAQs reside with the relevant chapter or section for ease of use. The chapters are organized to facilitate use of the practice note and to align it with the structure of the SAO. Chapter 1 introduces the practice note. It is followed by 4 chapters, Chapter 2 through Chapter 5, that line up with the 4 required sections of the SAO: identification, scope, opinion, and relevant comments. Sections 3 through 6 of the NAIC SAO instructions. As described in the NAIC SAO instructions, the actuarial opinion must consist of an identification paragraph identifying the appointed actuary, a scope paragraph identifying the subject on which an opinion is to be expressed and describing the scope of the appointed actuary's work, an opinion paragraph expressing his or her opinion with respect to such subject, and 1 or more additional relevant comments paragraphs. These 4 sections must be clearly designated. Chapter 6 provides additional considerations around the SAO, including filing requirements and considerations when the appointed actuary becomes aware of errors in the SAO. Chapter 7 covers the AOS, and Chapter 8 covers the actuarial report, which is considered to be the culmination of the SAO process. Finally, Chapter 9 provides resources for the appointed actuary. The 4 appendices have been organized to make it easier to locate pertinent information. Appendix 1 provides the NAIC, SAO, and AOS instructions, along with the excerpt of the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions regarding auditor data testing. Appendix 2 provides the 2022 AOWG regulatory guidance. Appendix 3 contains more detailed information about specific topics that may not be common to all SAOs. Appendix 4 provides the SSAPs from NAIC's Accounting Practices and Procedures Manual, deemed to be particularly applicable to actuaries signing NAIC P&C SAOs. Following the terminology in the NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, this practice note uses the term loss reserves to include LAE reserves unless specified otherwise. Changes from the 2021 practice note. COPLFR has made enhancements to the 2022 practice note based on feedback from users and a thorough review by the committee. Changes to this year's practice note that are a result of new 2022 requirements from the ASB or NAIC, i.e., new or revised ASOP, NAIC Annual Statement Instructions, or SSAP, are highlighted in yellow, while additional discussion or clarifying edits are highlighted in gray. Changes to the 2021 practice note include qualification standards for actuaries issuing statements of actuarial opinion in the United States effective January 1, 2022 for SAOs made in 2023 are outlined below. Specifically, the changes made to the U.S. qualification standards, USQS, that affect property and casualty actuaries are summarized below and discussed in the remainder of this practice note. Basic education, subject area knowledge, bias topics continuing education, recognition of the general insurance track. Review and update citations of 2022 version of NAIC documents throughout. NAIC SAO instructions, and the AOWG regulatory guidance. Reference to newly 2022 updated risk transfer practice note. Additional potential risk factor examples for consideration. Updates to section on considerations related to COVID-19. Minor updates to section on company representations to the appointed actuary. Additional references to ASOP number 56. Update of external references and hyperlinks throughout, and other minor edits throughout. Changes to the NAIC SAO instructions for 2022 were related to removal of the additional categorization of continuing education requirement for appointed actuaries, clarification around the review of the appointed actuary's qualification documentation by the Board of Directors, additional statement requirement in the identification paragraph, signature information included in the actuarial report. The 2022 AOWG regulatory guidance was updated for changes made to the 2022 NAIC SAO instructions. Changes include future considerations for year-end 2023 opinions and a de-emphasis on COVID-19 commentary in situations where the impact on reserves is not significant.